Good evening, tributes, and welcome back to Tales of the Hunger Games. I hope that everyone is well and that you have had a sublime week wherever you are. Before we begin, I'd like to give my usual thanks to the fabulous Andrew McLean for all the artwork that he has produced, as well as my Patreons for their continued financial pledge, which is much appreciated. I'm also going to mention the Tales of the Hunger Games Discord, which discusses pretty much everything to do with this series, as well as the general Hunger Games Discord, where tales are created based on your choices. Feel free to find the links for both of these in the description, as well as plenty of other links to do with this series. I'm also going to be doing a Q&A at the end of the next video that I think will be a cheeky two-parter. So if you'd like to ask me a question, feel free to reply it to the attached comment below. It could be about the Hunger Games in general, it could be anything about this series, or just anything in general about the world or myself or whatnot. You come up with it. I like the weird questions. Also, speaking of next week's video, it might be slightly later than planned just because I've got plenty that's going on next week and I don't want to rush through it. I'm sure you can understand. Therefore, it might be on Tuesday, probably not Wednesday, but might be Tuesday. I will keep you informed on Twitter though. Find that in the description as well. Anyway, without further ado, let's go. Although District 10 had not had the best record in the Hunger Games since the Reclamation, it could certainly be argued that many of their tributes had at least entertained the capital with their manners of fighting and determination. Therefore, as District 10's games drew nearer, a wave of excitement was clearly felt throughout the capital. Thibaut Girardot and Begonia Shanks, district victors of the 100th Hunger Games, arrived in District 10 early on the Monday morning and were given the usual tour by Mayor Suzuki along with several peacekeepers. Although the pair seemed engaged with this tour, Begonia was clearly repulsed by the smell and sights of the district's largest abattoir, and when she was shown a cow being slaughtered, she gagged in disgust and ran out of the building. A peacekeeper then escorted her back to the mayor's manor, where she rested until it was time for the reaping. Thibaut and Begonia exchanged casual conversation on the reaping platform with the district officials, whilst the last of the district's orange-clad youths were ushered into the reaping enclosures beneath the scorching heat of the sun. A brief speech was given by Mayor Suzuki before Begonia was prompted by Chief Peacekeeper Harrington to choose a female name. She stepped forwards and, after breathing out a discontented sigh, announced that she had chosen 16-year-old Simmental Farnham. As the camera panned into the relevant section, a human crater formed around a pale young lady with short black curls and worn glasses. Yet instead of marching to the aisle like she was supposed to, Simmental simply stood and looked ahead, while shaking her head very slightly up and down with widened eyes. Eugenia Ravenstill then asked if she was going to faint, to which Rubius Dalton, victor of the 86th Hunger Games, replied that she could at least put on a brave face for the occasion. Simmental was subsequently dragged to the platform, and without saying a word, she shook hands with Begonia. Thibaut was then tapped on the back of the barrel of Chief Peacekeeper Harrington's gun, but he turned around and told Harrington not to touch him, which almost caused a fight, although Mayor Suzuki came between them and simply led Thibaut back to the reaping bowl. He proceeded to choose Rasper, aged 17, who remained stone-faced and quiet as he made his way to the platform. Then Begonia chose Katla, aged 17, who immediately burst into tears upon hearing her name, and even slapped a nearby girl who laughed, although before another fight could ensue, Katla was swiftly removed from the enclosure. Mayor Suzuki once again ushered Thibaut to choose another name, which he did, to reveal that 17-year-old Lactonio Marquez was the next reaped. When the camera found Lactonio, Eugenia remarked that his orange suit was not very flattering on his larger frame, to which Rubius replied that maybe he was trying to dress like a real orange, which made Eugenia jokingly hit Rubius and tell him not to exaggerate. Yet as Lactonio was escorted to the platform, he smiled at the other youths who looked at him, then warmly shook hands with Thibaut, which led Eugenia to commend him for his apparent optimism. Although whilst Lactonio supportively patted Rasper on the shoulder, Rubius replied that she should wait for the games. The next tribute to be reaped was Frida, aged 18, who Rubius remarked to be one of the most toned female youths. Eugenia also noticed the blood on Frida's dress, and Rubius guessed that she worked in the abattoir that had been opened during the tour. Spur, aged 13, then seemed to hold back tears when his name was called, but once he was on the platform, he was given a nod of support by Lactonio, aged 18. The next female tribute was revealed to be Bianca, aged 17, who Eugenia critiqued for snarling as she walked down the aisle, although Rubius pointed at her muscular frame and said that she appeared skilled. Following Bianca, the next tribute to be reaped was 18-year-old Tobe Looper, and the camera quickly panned in on the back of the male enclosure. As Tobe walked to the platform, his olive skin and unkempt curls seemed to show more movement and personality than Tobe himself, who remained extremely stoic and emotionless throughout. Following him was Elle, aged 12, who froze to the spot upon hearing her name, whilst Rubius joked that her oversized orange dress was stopping her from moving. Luther, aged 18, swiftly followed, and Eugenia gasped at his height, that was a little less than 7 foot, to which Rubius commended that this could give him a large advantage in the games. The next reaped was then revealed to be Rhaenyra, aged 15, who, to the surprise of many, laughed then smiled as she walked down the aisle and shook hands with Begonia, although Eugenia said that this merry behaviour could be due to nerves. After a brief pause for a drink of water, Thibaut announced that the next male tribute was 16-year-old Diego Waxler, and the camera soon found a freckle-faced young man with slick-back red hair that glowed in the sunlight. When he heard his name, Diego looked more like he had just been minorly inconvenienced than reaped for the games, and he walked down the aisle without any delay. Begonia then thrust her hand into the female reaping bowl once more, before calling out the name of 13-year-old Clara Paranova. The camera swiftly found a thin girl with scrappy, fair-coloured curls, who looked around in bewilderment as the peacekeepers came towards her. Whilst they dragged Clara from the enclosure, she turned around and called to her sister, Anna, who quickly made her way to the aisle side of the enclosure. Clara shouted once more, and Anna ran into the aisle, before pushing past a pair of peacekeepers and running down the aisle towards her sister. Murmurs of shock flowed through the crowd as Chief Peacekeeper Harrington jumped off the platform, then knocked past Clara and grabbed onto Anna when she was just meters from Clara. She pushed against Harrington, and he almost fell over. Then in his anger, he slapped Anna across the face and ordered her to re-enter the enclosure. However, as she looked back to Harrington, she stunned both Capital and District viewers by volunteering to take Clara's place. Even Chief Peacekeeper Harrington looked up in surprise towards Mayor Suzuki, before grinning and stating that District 10 now had 8 female tributes. Sounds of confusion and then outrage rippled through the enclosures and crowds, whilst Anna shouted that she was volunteering for her sister, but Harrington smiled, and with the help of 2 other peacekeepers, dragged both sisters to the platform. Clara subsequently cried and screamed, whilst the protests of the crowds grew louder. The peacekeepers on the platform withdrew their guns, and Capital TV quickly switched to Eugenia, who was saying that this reminded her of a reaping that she had seen when she was a teenager, to which Rubius laughed out loud. After another minute, the cameras returned to the reaping square, where order had been restored, and once the camera focused on the stage, Anna's olive skin was shown to have paled in comparison, whilst Clara was gripping onto her hand and sobbing. Thibaut was then instructed to choose the final 2 male tributes. He called the names of Stack, aged 15, and Jorge, aged 12, who both appeared dazed, with the latter bursting into tears that he swiftly tried to hide. As Stack and Jorge were escorted down the aisle, jeers from the crowd sounded once more, but this time the peacekeepers shot their guns. They kindly did this over the heads of the crowds, in order to avoid casualties, but this still caused further uproar and chaos, whilst the 16 newly reaped tributes were rushed through the stable and into the town hall. Chaos also ensued within the building, where most of the tributes were asking in a panic about what was happening in the reaping square behind them, from which shots and screams could still be heard, whilst the peacekeepers proceeded to push them forwards through the main corridor of the building. However, all 16 tributes were soon forced into the cars on the other side of the building that were then driven to the nearby station. By the time the tributes were being escorted onto the train, all of them except for Cutler appeared to realise that resistance was futile, but after receiving a sharp slap from a peacekeeper, she finally mounted the steps amidst another flood of tears. Within 2 minutes, all tributes were walking to the dining carriage of the train, where the shutters had already been lowered, which therefore left the carriage in complete darkness. Once they were all inside the dining carriage, they were all led to an available seat by the Avoxes present, who were wearing night vision goggles. The train began to move, and Clara called for Anna, but she was quickly hushed by a peacekeeper, and a few seconds later, Horn of Plenty blared out through the carriage, whilst most tributes simply sat still and appeared scared. Yet once the train had travelled beyond the main settlements of District 10, the anthem gradually ceased, whilst the Avoxes opened the blinds, and many of the tributes squinted at the sunlight that flowed in from the windows. The peacekeepers then informed them that they could now move within the carriage if they so wished. Whilst most tributes immediately got up and began to speak to each other, Simmental, aged 16, remained still for a little longer, and appeared dazed by the amount of tributes in this carriage. However, after a few minutes had passed, she noticed a bookcase on the far wall, next to where Jorge, aged 12, was now sat on his own. Simmental headed over, and after looking at the books, she decided to read one about the history of the capital. She looked up and was seen to listen to other tributes' conversations every now and then, but seemed predominantly engaged in this book. As for Diego, aged 16, he slowly made his way through the carriage, whilst appearing to look for something. However, when he was in the far corner of the carriage, near to where Simmental was now reading, he waited until nobody was looking, before snatching a silver clock from a table next to the bookcase, without apparently realizing that there were cameras throughout the carriage. Although a peacekeeper was informed about this through his earpiece, he did not act, later stating that he wanted to see how much Diego would try to take. Tobe, aged 18, at first seemed quiet, and unlike most other tributes, he did not initiate any conversation. After a minute, Stack, aged 15, approached Tobe and stated that he was friends with his younger brother, Raid, before attempting to start a conversation, although it soon appeared obvious to Stack that Tobe was not interested in talking and was instead now looking at Bianca, aged 17, and Frida, aged 18, who were discussing their work within the middle of the carriage. Meanwhile, Lactonio, aged 17, initially remained in his seat and looked ahead, seemingly in a daze. After almost 10 minutes, he looked around and smiled at Clara, aged 13, and Anna, aged 17, who were talking on a nearby sofa, whilst the latter smiled back briefly. Lactonio also looked over to Rusper, aged 17, who was sat on the other side, but he appeared to be asleep already. Once the blinds had been raised, it soon became clear that Anna was still in shock, and after realizing this, Clara apologized that she was in the games as well, but Anna immediately interrupted that this was not Clara's fault, whilst glaring at a passing peacekeeper. Anna then said that it would at least be worth volunteering if Clara made it out of the games alive, to which she tearfully replied that she did not want Anna to die. However, Anna then smiled and said that they would have twice the chance of survival if they stayed together. For the next half hour, the sisters appeared to be playing a game with a small piece of string that they called a cat's cradle, but the Avoxes present reported that they could also be heard discussing other tributes, until Michele Onassis and Casco Astriana, victors of the 54th and 98th Hunger Games, entered the carriage. A few tributes got out of their seats and advanced towards them, but Michele raised her hands and said that she and Casco would come and speak to each of them in turn. Casco then firmly ordered the tributes to sit down, which made Michele look at him in exasperation. Many tributes waited in suspense as Michele and Casco cast their gazes over them. Michele then used her cane to hobble over to Anna and Clara, whilst Lactonio watched them from the adjacent seat. Clara initially seemed intimidated and even leaned back, but Michele frowned and stated with a grin that she was not trying to attack her, although Clara was still clearly unnerved. After congratulating Anna for her bravery and having a brief conversation with the sisters, Michele looked over to Lactonio for a few seconds, whilst he remained completely still. She then beckoned him to come over, and after making sure that no other tributes were listening, she asked if he worked in an abattoir. Lactonio appeared surprised that Michele knew this, but responded that he did, although only out the back, before asking why. Yet without answering, Michele said that they could make a decent trio, then moved to Rhaenyra and Stack, both aged 15, as Lactonio introduced himself properly to the sisters. Meanwhile, Casco had walked into the next section of the carriage, where Tobe, Frida, and Bianca had just begun to speak to each other. Without even introducing himself, Casco asked them what their names were, before looking at some parchment and checking the details. He then declared that this could be a strong alliance, and the trio looked at each other whilst Casco approached Luther, aged 18, and after a brief word, he joined Tobe, Frida, and Bianca and awkwardly introduced himself. During this time, Simmental and Diego rested at the back of the carriage until Michele finally reached them and introduced herself, whilst Casco was still busy talking to Stack, aged 15, who seemed increasingly overwhelmed and uncomfortable by what Casco was saying. Michele started by speaking to Simmental, who once again seemed very shy, and only nodded or shook her head to Michelle's questions, without even looking her in the eye. Yet after a while of realizing that she would not receive much of a response, Michelle jolted around to feel Diego's hand in her pocket. Seconds before, it was seen by the Avoxes present that Diego had been trying to remove Michelle's parchment from her pocket, but as this did not constitute an emergency, they were not allowed to communicate with her. However, just as Diego was trying to remove his hand, Michelle suddenly grabbed him by the arm and pushed him against the wall, before yanking his arm up his back, which made him squeal as the other tributes looked on. As Diego protested, Michelle rammed her cane across his neck, and stated that tributes acting in such a cowardly manner made her hoarse with rage. Diego begged to be released, and only after Michelle had made him promise her that he would not try anything like this, she eventually let go. Michelle then ignored Diego, and moved down the carriage to speak to Cutler, aged 17, who was crying once more. Simmental was briefly seen to smirk at Diego, which he appeared to notice, but she swiftly refocused her attention on her book once more, until 10 minutes later, when the Avoxes brought the lunch buffet into the carriage. The tributes then ate, mainly within the groups that they appear to have formed as alliances. During this time, Casco ate and watched Capital TV on his private screen, where the reaping was being reanalyzed, whilst Michelle gradually made her way through the carriage to speak to the tributes once again. However, just as she reached the end, where Simmental and Diego were eating in silence, Jorge stole the last slice of meat from Tobe's plate, which he very nearly failed to notice. Tobe quickly chased after Jorge, who was still trying to hide this meat behind his back. He then smashed Jorge's neck against the wall and ordered him to drop it, although Jorge laughed and pointed at Lactonio, before saying that he was the most likely to steal food. Tobe then smashed Jorge's head against the wall once more, and Casco simply watched in amusement, before signalling to the Avoxes present to not intervene. Yet Michelle quickly approached, and after glaring at Casco, she pinched Tobe's neck and pulled him off Jorge. Meanwhile, Clara said to Lactonio that she was sorry for what Jorge had said, but he smiled and replied that he had been called worse. With 1 hour left before they were due to arrive in the capital, it appeared that Michelle was rather exhausted from having to watch over 16 tributes, and she told them all to head to their private carriages. Brief sounds of protest were heard throughout the carriage, but she quickly pressed a button on the wall, and within 10 seconds the peacekeepers had entered. They escorted the tributes to these carriages without further incident, and Michelle napped on a sofa at the far end of the carriage, whilst Casco watched the 98th Hunger Games that he had won 2 years prior. As the train entered the outskirts of the capital, Michelle asked for the tributes to be retrieved from their carriages, and over the next few minutes they returned to the dining carriage, with some dreary-eyed, whilst others were in deep conversation with each other. Simmental was still quiet, whilst Diego appeared fatigued. As for Tobe, he was talking to Luther about the District 11 games, whilst Frida and Bianca discussed how nice the pillows in the carriages were. Anna was also keeping an eye on Clara, whilst having a conversation with Lactonio about their mutual friends in District 10. 5 minutes later, the train arrived in Snow Station, but Diego was kept behind, much to his displeasure. The peacekeepers searched his pockets and found the silver clock and a few other ornaments, but upon noticing that he was not in possession of all that were missing, he was interrogated further, and other cameras were checked. Yet it was not until after these games that the missing ornaments were in fact found in the room of Simmental, who was theorized to have taken them whilst Diego was distracted by the fight between Tobe and Jorge. Once Diego had received a brief beating from the peacekeepers, who still did not believe that he was not in possession of the remaining ornaments, all tributes were escorted into the limousines and then taken to the accommodation tower, where they were assorted into pairs by Michelle and escorted into their respective apartments by the peacekeepers. Once they were inside, Michelle insisted that the male tributes remain chivalrous and offer their female cohabitants the first choice of bedroom, which most of these male tributes did, despite not appearing to understand what the word chivalrous meant. Lactonio and Clara were placed in apartment 2, where they spent the afternoon watching the 97th Hunger Games, which Lactonio remembered to be one of the less gruesome games. Although Clara still seemed phased after watching these games, Lactonio analysed how certain tributes could have avoided their deaths, which Clara seemed to understand, and she even seemed to come up with her own suggestions towards the end of the games. After dinner, Michelle visited and asked both Clara and Lactonio how they thought that they could support each other in the games. The pair both seemed a little confused by this question, but Michelle remained stoic as she waited for an answer. Lactonio said that he was skilled with an axe from his work in the forest, Then Michele gazed at Clara, who answered that she never needed sleep, and was good at hiding from her sister, Anna. Michele seemed satisfied, and after a few more questions to check on their well-being, she left the apartment, which caused Clara to cry, and Lactonio tried to comfort her. Meanwhile, Diego and Anna had been placed together in apartment 5. Whilst Diego paced through the apartment and admired all the artifacts, Anna spent most of her time on the balcony. At first she seemed to be looking over the balcony, possibly for any sign of Clara, but the only tribute she saw was Elle, aged 12, in the apartment below, who had just stormed onto her balcony after arguing with Jorge, aged 12. When Michele came to visit the pair, she almost immediately asked Diego if he was trying to be killed before the games. He then appeared confused by what Michele had meant, but insisted that he would give his best efforts in the games, and Michele looked at him pensively for a few seconds, before finally looking away. She then stated that she had placed Anna and Diego together for a reason, before telling Anna that Clara was fine, and that she was very brave for volunteering, which left Anna with a weak smile as Diego looked on in a dumbfounded state. As for Simmental, she had been placed with Spur, aged 13, in apartment 6. Whilst he spent most of the afternoon napping in his room, Simmental read a selection of books and occasionally played chess against herself, whilst occasionally turning on Capital TV, but with no programs airing except for those regarding the upcoming games. She soon abandoned her efforts to find something to her taste on the screen, before sitting alone on the balcony and numbly watching the sunset. Casco came to the apartment when Simmental and Diego were finishing their dinner. He seemed to be rather inebriated, and announced that he was not staying for long, before asking the pair how they planned to kill the other tributes. In a cautious yet bewildered tone, Simmental said that she would try to find a source of poison and plant it into their food or drink. Casco simply belched, and looked at Spur, who said that he would try to kill them with a sword, although this made Casco laugh, and he left the apartment shortly after. When he finally reached the 8th floor, Casco barged in to find Tobe and Frida being intimate, which caused the pair to shout as Frida quickly covered herself. Once they were decent, Casco came back in and apologized, then spoke in a relatively calm manner. He assumed correctly that Tobe and Frida were going to be fighting together, before stating that whilst this may be a good idea, they would need to kill Bianca, aged 17, and Luther, aged 18, if they wanted to win. Casco then excused himself, whilst Tobe and Frida muttered to each other in confusion. The next day, the tributes were awoken early by Michele and Casco, who gave them 10 minutes to ready themselves, before taking them to the training centre. Training Master Dalton explained the rules of the training centre, and pointed to a new station that featured whips made of horsehair. He then grinned as he stated that he would not hesitate to use them if needed. Like several other tributes, Simmental immediately headed to the newly configured bovine station, which featured several very lifelike cowbots, along with one real cow, although unlike most of the tributes, she worked alone and practically ignored the others. While Simmental was learning how to trim and clean one of the cowbot's hooves, Spur, aged 13, attempted to talk to her, but she seemed to not even notice his efforts at conversation and continued listening to the cowbot's instructions. She appeared to impress the other tributes with her ability to learn these bovine skills so quickly, but Elle, aged 12, was clearly most impressed when Simmental stood by the live cow and clicked her tongue in a way that made it lie on the floor in a docile manner. Elle then asked how Simmental did this, and she quietly responded that she had seen her father doing it, before heading to the bovine disease table, where her eyes seemed to scan over the information at an extremely fast pace. As for Diego, he wandered around the training centre and spent most of the first half hour watching other tributes, until Rubius ordered him to choose a station, and he chose the camouflage station. Over the next few hours, Diego became quite proficient in creating colours from different paints, and for half an hour towards the end of the morning, he rested within a silver background. However, he was later reprimanded by training staff after jumping out at Katla and Rasper, both aged 17, when they walked past, which made Katla drop a glass of water over herself. Yet shortly after being whipped, Diego saw Anna approaching the bovine station with Lactonio and Clara, and as they started milking one of the cowbots, he decided to join them. This trio had originally begun the morning together in the survival station, where Anna showed Clara and Lactonio how to make fire by slicing rocks together, which Clara and Lactonio were able to do with some assistance after a while. They then moved to the toxicological station, where Clara relayed what she knew about various toxic plants, although this did not appear to greatly help the others. After this, they worked in the axe-throwing station, where Lactonio helped Anna and Clara with their grip and aim on these weapons, which allowed them to at least hit near a target by the time they had finished. After watching the commotion occurring between Diego and Cutler in the adjacent camouflage station, the trio decided to head to the bovine station. Yet just as they were trying to milk one of the cowbots, Diego approached Anna and asked if he could join them. She looked towards Clara and Lactonio, the latter of whom immediately welcomed Diego and asked how he was finding the training. The quartet spent the rest of the training time in the station, and whilst Clara and Diego were trimming a cowbot's hooves, Anna quietly asked Lactonio why he was so nice. He gave a bittersweet smile as he looked back to her, before responding that the other tributes may be less likely to kill him if he was nice to them, to which he nodded and let out a weak smile. Meanwhile, Tobe spent most of the morning practicing his weightlifting skills and general fitness. He often looked up and made eye contact with Frida, who was fighting a member of training staff in the sparring station, Bianca, who was firing arrows with great accuracy in the archery station, and Luther, who was constantly beating his own times in the larger assault course. Occasionally, the quartet would meet in the middle of the floor and discuss the other tributes, whilst making no effort to hide the fact that they were working together. At one point, Stack was seen to be eavesdropping into their conversation while standing behind Bianca, but she swiftly turned around and threw her bow at him, which caused a fight to break out between them, although Bianca claimed that this was an accident, and so she avoided punishment. Shortly after the training staff had separated these tributes, the training time ended, and they were escorted back to their apartments. That evening, the main stage was decorated with an orange theme that matched District 10's colour, along with two enormous golden bulls that represented the district's main produce, and even Eugenia, Rubius, and former game maker Artulia Fling wore hints of orange within their mainly white outfits. After an enthusiastic introduction from Eugenia, Simmental was the first tribute to be interviewed. As she walked the runway in her flowing orange dress, she was clearly uncomfortable, and looked down at her feet until she was back at the stage, where even as the judges spoke to her, she failed to look them in the eye. For Simmental's chosen skill, she revealed that she would answer questions about bovine diseases, which appeared to surprise the crowd, and Rubius laughed a little. But after correctly answering 21 questions over the next 2 minutes, many of the crowd were clearly impressed. However, when Rubius began the subsequent questioning round by asking how the skill would help Simmental kill other tributes who might have a sword, for example, she became very tongue-tied and reserved once more. Eugenia asked a few more questions about alliances as well, but this appeared to faze Simmental even more. Her scores were then revealed to be 4-3-6, according to the judgment of Eugenia, Rubius, and Artulia, which scored her 4 overall, with this last score greatly surprising the audience, although once Simmental had left the stage, Artulia stated that she had a strange feeling about this one. After Rusper and Cutler scored pitifully, Lactonio was the next tribute to be interviewed. He politely introduced himself and impressed the judges and audience alike by throwing axes with great accuracy at several moving targets, whilst only missing a few of them by small distances. Lactonio then proceeded to give strong responses to the questions that were posed, until he was asked by Rubius if his large weight would affect him in the games. The audience suddenly became quiet, but Lactonio simply responded that whilst it was too late to lose weight, he would do the best he could, and maybe even use it to his advantage, which confused some audience members, but gathered applause from others nonetheless, and the scores were revealed to be 6-4-5 with an overall score of 5. After Bianca scored a 6, it was Tobe's turn, and he immediately impressed the audience with his tight-fitting orange waistcoat that clearly emphasized his muscular frame. He then announced that for his chosen skill, he would be displaying his strength, and a heavy weight bar with 2 attached weights of 50 kilograms each was brought onto the stage by 2 Avoxes. Tobe then took the bar from the floor, and after just a few seconds, was able to lift it over his head, where he held it for the next 60 seconds, amidst cheers of encouragement from the audience. When the minute finally came to an end, the audience and judges all cheered and applauded in admiration, and Tobe finally placed the weight bar back onto the floor. He dealt well with the following questions, although he did struggle a little on some hazard-based questions that were asked by Artulia. However, this did not stop him from scoring 6-7-6, with an overall score of 6. That was the strongest total score of any tribute so far. Elle, Luther, and Rhaenyra proceeded to score 1, 6, and 4 respectively. Then it was time for Diego's interview. In his luminous orange suit, he came across as slightly arrogant, and it was clear that many of the audience did not appreciate his manner as he strutted down the runway. Diego then announced that he had chosen to display camouflage for his chosen skill, which he proceeded to do by mixing various paints into a light blue paste that he used to cover his left arm against a sky blue background, which was shown on the screen behind. Although the audience appeared to be quite repelled by Diego's attitude, they were still clearly impressed by this display and applauded his efforts. However, he struggled during the following questions, especially when Rubius asked why he had chosen to steal from the capital during the train journey, which resulted in the audience jeering and then laughing as Diego stammered. The scores were then revealed to be 4-3-3, which scored him 3 overall. Following Diego was Clara, who was clearly intimidated by the large audience, but she managed to walk the runway with some presence and even twirled her dress when she was stood at the end. However, this confidence immediately disappeared when Clara was introduced to the judges. She then asked to display her knowledge of herbal toxicology, and over the next minute, 34 plants were shown on the screen that she had to identify as toxic or safe. Although Clara started well, she soon became panicked when she answered one wrong and ultimately scored just 25 out of 34. She did recover her nerve to some degree during the questions, but became rather emotional when Rubius asked her if she would be willing to kill Anna, which clearly threw her for the rest of the interview, and Clara scored 3-2-3, which gave her an overall score of just 3. After Stax scored a mediocre 4, it was Anna's turn, and she received high praise from the audience for the elegant topaz gown that she displayed on the runway. For her chosen skill, she surprised the audience by choosing to avoid holograms that would come at her from one of the onstage screens. Although Anna was quite restricted in her gown, she still managed to throw herself in various directions at rather sudden speeds, and despite losing one of her heels towards the end of the 2 minutes, she was only hit once on the leg during this entire time. However, Anna came across poorly to the capital during the questioning that followed, when she insinuated that she was not supposed to be in the games, before stating that the games should not exist at all, which caused the audience to jeer, and her interview was cut short. Anna ultimately scored 3-3-4, which gave her an overall score of 3, like her sister, although many speculate that if Anna had not shown disrespect to the capital, she would have scored higher. The next morning, all tributes were flown from the roof of the accommodation tower to the arena. They were each placed in a holding room, and instructed to dress in the black t-shirts, sandy-coloured trousers, and thick black boots that were provided. Over the next 15 minutes, Casco visited the male tributes, whilst Micheli visited their female counterparts. It is believed that whilst Micheli gave the girls some encouragement and support during this time, Casco opted to give advice to those that he saw as more likely to win, whilst simply shaking the hands of the others and saying goodbye. Once this time had elapsed, Micheli and Casco were led down the corridor towards the observation room. As they entered, Casco sniggered at Micheli's tears and she slapped him, which caused the peacekeepers to swiftly separate the pair, whilst Casco shouted that Micheli should not be so serious. Yet a moment later, they were distracted when the tributes were ordered to enter their tubes, and seconds later, they rose into the cornucopia oasis. District 10's games took place in an arena known as the Ringed Oasis. This district arena was circular and roughly average in size compared to the other 3 district arenas that have been seen so far, with a total radius of 1,500 meters. A flat and elevated oasis with a radius of 250 meters lay at the center of the arena. A sudden sandy drop surrounded this oasis that led into the middle ring of the arena that was approximately 750 meters in complete width. The middle ring rose gradually from the center of the arena and contained hundreds of stones, rocks, and even scant trees of all different shapes and sizes, which could potentially provide hiding places and sources of shelter for tributes. Towards the edge of the middle ring were 3 pairs of manageable horses that were spread equally around this distance from the cornucopia. However, as Eugenia and Rubius analysed these horses in the pre-games analysis, they appeared to disagree as to whether they would be willing for tributes to ride them through the arena. The outer ring then made up the 500 meters before the perimeter, where small sandy dunes lay over relatively flat ground, although as one reached the edge of the outer ring, the ground gradually morphed into the steep and unclimbable hills that formed the perimeter. The podiums lay in the middle of the central oasis, that was flat and grassy for the most part. It also contained a few jagged rocks and plants, along with a ring of tall rocks at its edge, just before the steep slope that led into the middle ring. These podiums were placed in a relatively small circle around the square pile of supplies. Within this pile were water bottles, loaves of bread, tarpaulins, ropes, and even climbing claws. Rubius was also excited during the pre-games analysis to see 4 chainsaws, with one at each corner of the square pile. They had been placed on the ground, but their blades were pointing upwards, and Rubius declared that he had always wanted to see these weapons in the games. As the podiums entered the arena and tributes accustomed themselves to the bright sun, many naturally looked around at their surroundings, with some seeming confused by the horizon, which featured both near and far away rocky hills that appeared to be alongside each other, which was allegedly designed this way in order to disorientate tributes. Before Anna's legs had even risen into the arena, she was desperately looking around for Clara, who she proceeded to spot on the opposite eastern side of the oasis. Anna seemed relieved once she had seen her, and even more so when she saw that Lactonio was on the podium next to Clara. Anna appeared to mime to Clara that she needed to breathe, and after looking at Lactonio, he winked back at Anna in reassurance. As the countdown then began, Clara looked ahead at the supplies and appeared visibly shaken by the chainsaws that glistened in the sunlight. As for Simmental, she was on a southwest podium next to Bianca, who was eagerly staring at the nearest chainsaw, before looking back at Simmental and grinning. This clearly intimidated Simmental, who rather strangely decided to look at her hands and count her fingers as the countdown began. On the other side of the ring of podiums was Tobe, who was clearly eyeing the northeastern chainsaw. Furthermore, with Rasper and Katla on his neighbouring podiums, Tobe seemed confident that he would be able to reach it first. On Katla's other side was Diego, who was placed on the northern side of the podium ring. Diego did not show any obvious emotions, and simply stared into the pile of supplies, but did not appear to be aiming for anything in particular until 5 seconds remained of the countdown, and the chainsaws suddenly activated. Several tributes appeared to jump slightly as a loud Vespine buzzing began. Katla had reacted the loudest, shrieking as the sound of the chainsaws began, and upon a replay, Tobe was seen to look at her strangely. Simmental closed her eyes and let out one final breath, then opened her eyes once more as the gong sounded. Like most tributes, she ran straight towards the pile of supplies and reached it shortly after 5 seconds, whilst viewers in Snow Square cheered on. Bianca grabbed the chainsaw just a second before Simmental entered the supply square, but like the others who had gone for the chainsaw, she appeared to find it slightly heavier than expected. Bianca then waved the chainsaw towards Simmental, but it missed her thigh by a matter of inches, which allowed her to run on to grab a bottle of water, whilst Bianca reconfigured her grip on the chainsaw. Simmental and Jorge grabbed the same bottle, but instead of fighting for it, Simmental simply grabbed another, but as she was about to run back, Stack pushed Jorge over towards Simmental, which caused her to trip. She quickly grabbed her water bottle and got to her feet, but in a panic ran straight ahead towards Bianca, who was now holding the chainsaw at the ready. Meanwhile, Anna had sprinted in from the west when the gong sounded. She managed to snatch a tarpaulin and water bottle, then very quickly glanced up to see Clara still stood on her podium on the other side of the oasis. As Anna looked in front of Clara to see Lactonio being chased by Luther, who was now in possession of a chainsaw, she suddenly heard a buzzing coming from her left, before looking over to see that Frida had just grabbed the northwestern chainsaw. Anna yelped and quickly jumped over the supplies past Bianca, who had just pushed Simmental into the ground with her own chainsaw. Yet whilst Frida chased Anna over the supplies, she accidentally held her chainsaw out too far to her right, and as she ran past, it sliced Bianca in the lower back, which made her scream, although it was debated during a later analysis if this was in fact an accident. As Anna continued running, Bianca lashed around and gasped at Frida, who looked shocked by what was happening. Yet just as blood began to spurt from Bianca's wound, Frida quickly sliced the chainsaw across her neck, before running on, whilst Bianca collapsed to the floor and Luther looked on in anger. Meanwhile, Lactonio had also run into the cornucopia from the eastern side of the ring, although he arrived a second after most other tributes. He appeared to be heading for a bottle of water that lay on the outside of the pile, but just seconds before he was about to reach this bottle, Luther grabbed the northeastern chainsaw, which he carried as he charged south towards Lactonio. However, just as Luther was about to bring back the weapon, Lactonio managed to dodge the saw and punch Luther in the face, which made him fall slightly and his grip on the chainsaw faltered as he clutched his bleeding nose. Yet just as Lactonio looked ready to grab a bottle, Rhaenyra ran straight into him and the pair fell to the floor, in front of where Luther was now standing, whilst Anna ran around towards Clara, who had been watching these scenes in shock. A few seconds later, Anna reached Clara, who was now shaking and crying as she watched Luther bringing down the chainsaw onto Lactonio and Rhaenyra, until he looked ahead to see Frida killing Bianca. However, just as Tobe began to run with his own chainsaw towards Luther, Anna practically dragged Clara off the podium, and they ran north, whilst Clara continued to cry, and Anna tried to calm her, which soon proved to be difficult whilst running. Meanwhile, Tobe had quickly grabbed the northeastern chainsaw, which he swung towards Elle, who was just meters to his right, although she managed to jump back before grabbing a loaf and bottle, then fleeing northwest. Tobe then held the chainsaw at the ready as he guarded the northeastern corner of the pile, which stopped many others from even attempting to take these supplies. He watched intently as Simmental was killed by Bianca, then gasped in surprise when Frida slashed Bianca's neck with her chainsaw. But it was at this moment that he noticed Luther looking up from Lactonio and Rhaenyra, whilst looking ready to run over the supplies towards Frida. However, as Luther began to run over the supplies, he accidentally tripped on a water bottle and fell to the ground. Tobe swiftly ran over the supplies towards Luther, whose chainsaw narrowly avoided his leg, but just as Luther tried to scurry away, Tobe thrust his chainsaw into Luther's chest. Tobe then looked around, and he appeared to realize that all the surviving tributes except for Frida were now fleeing. They looked at each other in exhaustion, and only at that point appeared to realize that they were splattered in blood. Frida took a bottle and used some of the water inside to wash off this blood, before passing it to Tobe, who did the same, whilst she looked around and said which tribute she thought had gone in which direction, based on what she could see in the distance. However, Tobe was then distracted when Frida pointed to the north, where Diego was fighting Elle for her supplies. When the gong sounded, Diego had in fact run straight to the north, away from his podium, before resting behind a small rock, just as the deaths were beginning. He watched as certain tributes escaped with supplies and others were killed. They remained hidden behind the rock when Anna and Clara ran past. However, when Diego saw Elle fleeing from the centre of the oasis and running towards his rock, he remained hidden, but peeked his head out very slightly in order to watch her. Almost a minute passed as Elle came nearer, until she finally ran just over 5 meters to the right of the rock, at which point Diego ran out and she screamed. He shouted at Elle to give her loaf of bread and water bottle, but she looked away and continued running. However, Diego quickly caught up with Elle, and she squealed in terror as he pushed her to the ground. He then grabbed the loaf and bottle that she had dropped before running northwest, whilst Elle ran east. Whilst Frida surveyed the remaining supplies, Tobe watched Diego and Elle running away, and he appeared ready to follow one of them. As Tobe picked up his chainsaw and looked ready to run, he told Frida to join him, but she quickly replied that they should stay with the supplies so that nobody else could steal them, and that they could find and kill Diego and Elle later. Although Tobe appeared a little hesitant, he heard chaotic screaming to his north, then looked back to the supplies, whilst Frida stated that they seemed to be killing each other already. He therefore stayed, and the pair grabbed the remaining loaves and bottles, which they put in 2 empty backpacks that lay within the supplies. Frida then looked more carefully at the 5 bodies to see who had been eliminated, and Tobe suggested leaving the other 2 chainsaws in Luther and Bianca's hands, so that these weapons would be removed with the bodies, and therefore not be available to other tributes. Once they had packed a sensible amount of the supplies, Tobe and Frida sat down to rest, and 7 minutes later, 5 cannons sounded as the hovercraft flew down from the roof of the arena that lay directly above them. Whilst they saw the bodies leaving the arena, Frida appeared to be surprisingly emotional, but Tobe held her hand and reminded her that if it weren't them, it would be us. Meanwhile, Anna and Clara had run north until they reached a large rock at the edge of the oasis that sloped down to the west. Clara panicked slightly, but Anna noticed a small gap between the west of this large rock and another that sloped down to the east. She quickly pulled Clara, and the girls ran towards the gap, but Clara suddenly stopped once more when she noticed the steep drop that followed. Clara immediately held back and was visibly scared about this steep drop into the middle ring. For the next minute, Anna tried to convince Clara that it would not hurt to slide down this hill, as it was indeed sandy, while she also occasionally looked back to check that nobody was coming for them. However, Diego had also run towards the northern rock, before looking for a gap beyond and running west. Then, just as Clara finally seemed willing to descend this sandy hill with Anna, Diego sprinted around the corner and collided with Anna. Laughter flowed through Snow Square as Diego, Anna, and Clara, who had been holding Anna's hand, all proceeded to tumble down this hill, whilst Clara screamed and even Diego let out panicked sounds, until the trio eventually came to a stop just meters in front of some scrappy rocks. Diego appeared to have hurt his left leg slightly, but he was the first to get to his feet, although Anna quickly got up after him and stood in front of Clara, who cowered behind whilst nursing her right shoulder. Diego appeared taken aback and grinned, before stating that they should stay together. Anna looked at him suspiciously, then asked why they should trust him, but he replied that he had nothing to gain from killing either of them, and they had nothing to gain from killing him, before adding that safety in numbers always proved vital in these games. In a tense standoff, Anna continued to eye Diego, who now looked rather surprised, until Clara came out from behind Anna and quietly said that she wanted to continue away from the central oasis. Anna hesitated, then beckoned to Diego to come with them. The trio jogged to the north, between the large rocks and stones, until they heard the 5 cannons sounding, then looked around to see the hovercraft collecting the bodies. As the hovercraft was leaving the arena, Clara noticed a large cluster of rocks that lay ahead, and asked for them to rest there for a while. Although Anna seemed intent on continuing north, Diego took out his water bottle and headed towards this cluster, whilst Clara followed him, and Anna seemed to realize that a rest may be a good idea. Whilst they caught their breath and hydrated themselves from the hot sun, Anna said that they could only rest for a few minutes, before heading north to the steep hills at the edge of the arena. Diego then replied that this cluster seemed fine, and that they should stay there for as long as possible, although this soon triggered an argument between the pair, with Diego accusing Anna of being bossy, whilst Anna accused Diego of not thinking logically. However, their argument was soon interrupted by Clara, who claimed a spot movement to their west. Meanwhile, Tobe and Frida had headed west through the central oasis after the hovercraft had left with the bodies. When the pair reached the steep drop into the middle ring, they attached a climbing claw to a large rock at the edge of the oasis and proceeded carefully down the sandy slope until they reached the bottom, at which point they looked out and carefully eyed the horizon for other tributes. Tobe and Frida continued west for the next 10 minutes, with their chainsaws held firmly at the ready as they visually scanned the horizon for any movement, although they failed to see anything. After a while, they decided to rest beneath a relatively well-kept tree that provided them with some shade from the scorching sun. Frida continued to drink some water and spoke about how this arena was even hotter than a hot day at home, but just after Tobe agreed, he suddenly got to his feet when he saw movement to the northeast. Stack suddenly appeared from behind a rock just 100 meters away, and he began to sprint from Tobe and Frida. Tobe quickly chased Stack with his chainsaw, while shouting at Frida to hurry, and after almost 10 seconds, she finally grabbed her chainsaw and the backpack, then ran after Tobe. However, Stack was able to run much faster than Tobe and Frida, the latter of whom seemed particularly weighed down by her chainsaw, and after a minute of Tobe continually looking behind to check on Frida, he appeared to realize that he had lost Stack, who viewers had seen to continue running in a more eastern direction. As Tobe appeared to realize that they had lost Stack, Frida caught up and apologized, but Tobe replied that it was not a problem and that they would find another one soon. Yet as they walked away, Rubius laughed and stated that one could see Tobe's annoyance. After 3 minutes, Clara spotted Stack walking east towards her, Diego, and Anna. The trio carefully peered out from the rock cluster, but they disagreed on who this was or in which direction they were even moving, possibly due to the heat rays on the horizon. Anna then said that it could be someone dangerous and that they should move before this person reached them. Clara briefly hesitated before grabbing her supplies and nonchalantly said to Diego that he could come with them if he wanted. As they jogged north up the hill towards the outer ring, they often looked around for movement. Stack was seen to spot them, but he turned southeast in order to avoid both them and Tobe and Frida. Diego and Clara seemed pleased to reach the outer ring, where the flatter terrain was easier to traverse, whilst Anna spent most of his time walking backwards, in order to keep watch for any tributes to the south. Diego was also drinking freely from his water, which Anna discouraged, reminding him that he needed to make this last, although he was seen to roll his eyes as he turned around. After almost half an hour, the trio reached the northern hills, where Diego soon found a sheltered crevice of shade behind a large wall of rock. He and Clara almost immediately sat down, whilst Anna looked out to check that no other tributes had seen them entering this stony crevice. Diego quickly helped himself to his water once more, until he saw Clara looking longingly towards the bottle, at which point he begrudgingly held out the bottle for her to take, which she proceeded to do, before thanking Diego as she gave it back. As for Tobe and Frida, they continued walking northeast whilst looking carefully for any more tributes and discussing their lives back in District 10. It soon emerged that the pair had several mutual friends and had even met once before during a hoedown, but just as Tobe was complimenting Frida on how pretty he thought she was when he first saw her, she suddenly stopped walking and held her chainsaw at the ready. Tobe quickly noticed that Frida had stopped, and he looked ahead to see 2 large brown horses tied up to a large rock that lay just 200 meters ahead. Tobe and Frida slowly approached, whilst carefully watching the horses for any sudden movements, but it was not until the pair were within 50 meters of the horses that one of them began to look at Frida. As they slowly crept nearer, the saddles on the horses' backs became visible, and Frida asked if it was safe to ride them. Tobe looked pensively at the horses, whilst Frida stated that she was more of a cowgirl, but when they were just 10 meters away, he asked Frida to check what food they had. She seemed a little confused, but proceeded to look inside the backpack before pulling out a loaf of bread. Tobe then ripped some of this bread into scraps, before walking towards the horses with these scraps in his hand, although they soon appeared uninterested, with one of the horses even breathing out in apparent annoyance. Frida tried offering a few other items from their backpack, but this also failed to work. However, just when Tobe appeared ready to move onwards, he suddenly spotted a tree that lay about 20 meters to their north, that appeared to be growing fruit, unlike every other tree that he had seen so far in this arena. Tobe approached this tree and plucked some of its yellow berries, before mashing them up with his hands and holding them out to the horses. This time they appeared very pleased with what Tobe had to offer, and as they continued to lick his hands clean, he prompted Frida to grab some of the fruit from this tree as well. She did this quickly, and as the horses ate the berries from her hands, Tobe mounted one of the horses, who did not seem to mind him. Despite some initial reservations, Frida then mounted the other horse, and the pair carefully held their chainsaws as they began to ride east. Both Tobe and Frida appeared to have some trouble riding these horses, with Rubius mentioning that they were both apparently more experienced with cows, although they soon appeared to adjust and continued east. They spent the next 2 hours riding slowly through the northern section of the middle ring, whilst narrowly avoiding Elle, who managed to hide herself between a small rock and hence avoid detection from the pair. They continued east and up the inclined ground towards the eastern outer ring. Horn of Plenty then played, and as Tobe and Frida dismounted their horses, the portraits of Simmental, aged 16, Lactonio, aged 18, Bianca, aged 17, Luther, aged 18, and Rhaenyra, aged 15, were shown, which left 11 tributes. Meanwhile, Anna, Clara, and Diego had spent the last 2 hours resting in the northern crevice. Anna had insisted that at least one of them kept watch at any given time, which the trio proceeded to do by taking 10-minute shifts and changing. Clara had begun to throw some stones at a target on a rock face, towards the back of the crevice, and when asked by Diego what she was doing, she explained that she was practicing her aim. However, this soon appeared to annoy Diego, who claimed that the sounds of these stones hitting the rocks was enough to drive anyone insane. Anna then responded that there were worse things for Clara to be doing, instead of improving her fighting skills, especially given that she was his ally, although she now appeared too focused on her stone throwing to acknowledge Diego's comment. He rolled his eyes and walked towards Clara, whilst Anna quickly widened her eyes in worry and grabbed a stone. However, she then appeared surprised to see Diego showing Clara how to improve her aim, by holding her breath and adjusting her grip on the stone, which appeared to help her. Anna then smiled as she watched the two conversing, before looking out between the crevice once more, where Horn of Plenty began to play, and she saw the portraits of the 5 fallen tributes. Tobe and Frida spent the next few hours heading clockwise around the middle ring. They occasionally stopped and allowed their horses to rest, whilst looking out over the horizon for any signs of movement, but they still failed to see any more tributes, which seemed to annoy Tobe, who asked where they could be hiding, but Frida assured him that they would find them. As the darkness of night set in, the pair proceeded to ride into the southeastern outer ring, but just as Frida asked where they should rest that night, Tobe suddenly stopped his horse and pointed northwest. Frida watched as Spurs suddenly ran to hide behind a rock roughly 100 meters away, but it was already too late for him, as Tobe quickly hurried his horse to run in this direction, and Frida soon followed. Spur continued to dart northwest between the rocks and trees, but Tobe and Frida's horses swiftly caught up with him, whilst they revved their chainsaws that sliced through the air. Spur then tripped on a stone, but just as he was getting to his feet, Frida rode past and slashed him over the back with her chainsaw, which spurted blood into the air as he screamed and fell to the ground. Frida and Tobe both came to a sudden stop, while Spur begged for mercy, and Frida gave him a bittersweet smile. Tobe then descended from his horse and sliced his chainsaw across Spur's throat, which sounded his cannon just seconds later. After hearing Spur's cannon and seeing his body being removed by the hovercraft, Clara quickly retreated into the crevice and cuddled against Anna, who asked Diego if he could keep watch. Clara said that she was scared, but Anna consoled her and said that she would not let anyone hurt her. However, as Clara rested her head over Anna's shoulder, Diego looked around and raised his eyebrows at Anna, but she gave him a stern look in return and shook her head. Anna looked worried when Diego began to speak, but she appeared to relax when he simply mentioned that they should have something to eat. He took out his loaf of bread and shared it between himself, Clara, and Anna, before stating that they should enjoy a last supper. Anna immediately glared at Diego, but he replied that although it could indeed be their last supper, they should enjoy it as much as they could. Anna still looked at him with exasperation, but after Clara finished her mouthful, she nodded and said that Diego was right, which left Anna appearing rather perplexed as Diego grinned and nodded to her. However, when Clara was talking a minute later, Diego and Anna quickly silenced her after hearing footsteps approaching from outside the crevice. Meanwhile, in the southwestern sector, Tobe and Frida were continuing to ride south into the outer ring. They narrowly missed Katla, who, thanks to the impending darkness, was able to hide behind a large boulder and hence avoid this pair. They continued riding towards the perimeter, but a few minutes later a cannon sounded, and they turned around to see the hovercraft collecting a body from the far north of the arena. Frida looked pensively in this direction, but Tobe said that they could get them later, and Frida appeared happy to agree. After almost 10 more minutes, Tobe and Frida reached a gap within the southeastern hills, where they proceeded to rest, eat, and drink as darkness completely set in. Once they appeared adequately rested, Frida pleasured Tobe, whilst he promised to take her somewhere nice if they both made it back to District 10 alive, to which Rubius joked that Tobe would be held to this if it happened. Frida smiled and said that she accepted this offer, but that this was the weirdest first date she had ever had, to which Eugenia laughed and replied that she had had many weirder dates herself. Tobe and Frida continued to talk, whilst Frida lay her head on Tobe's chest and looked up at the stars. However, Tobe soon noticed that Frida had become quiet, and he asked her what was wrong. Through tears, she appeared to have a minor breakdown about these games and the fact that she had killed Bianca earlier, but Tobe made her look him in the eye as he stated that it's them or us. Whilst Tobe expanded on this point, Frida appeared to become stable once more, and he kissed her as she snuggled against him. Meanwhile, Diego and Anna had tried to quieten Clara when they heard footsteps approaching from the east and heading towards their base within the northern crevice of the rocks. Diego quickly held a defensive stance, and Clara grabbed a rock, but seconds later, Jorge suddenly appeared at the entrance of this crevice. Clara quickly gasped, although upon a replay, Diego and Anna seemed slightly relieved, with Rubius stating that they were probably relieved to see a younger and weaker opponent. Whilst Clara gripped to Anna, Jorge appeared to be struggling to stand properly. Then he grabbed onto the rock next to the entrance and asked if he could have some water. Although it was dark, Anna and Diego seemed able to see each other's expressions of bewilderment at this unusual request, and Rubius joked that Jorge was indeed a cheeky bugger. Diego turned back to Jorge and told him to try the centre of the arena, but not come back. However, Jorge quickly fell to his knees and seemed to cry as he begged for water, stating that he had not had any all day, but Diego quickly got up and shouted at Jorge to leave before he killed him. Jorge quickly stumbled back in fright before heading west. Diego watched as he hobbled away, whilst occasionally gripping onto the rocks on his right, but after just a minute, he lost consciousness and smacked his head against one of the rocks as he fell. Anna heard this sound and asked Diego what he could see, to which he replied that he could only see that Jorge had fallen. He continued to watch Jorge's legs, that at first twitched, then ceased moving, and a minute later his cannon sounded. This time, Clara hardly reacted to the cannon, but as the hovercraft entered the arena to take Jorge's body, Diego quickly ordered the girls to grab the supplies, as they needed to leave before other tributes came to inspect this area, and within a minute, Diego was leading Anna and Clara southwest towards the middle ring. Over the next hour, they moved carefully through the darkness until they entered the northwestern middle ring. Clara picked up several small stones during this journey and pointed out a pair of white horses to Anna when they passed them, but when Diego heard Clara, he stated that horses were stubborn creatures and not worth trying to control. The trio therefore continued walking until they found a sheltered cluster of rocks within the western middle ring. A few minutes later, Horn Aplenty played, and the portraits of Spur, aged 13, and Jorge, aged 12, were shown, which left 9 tributes remaining. For the next 2 hours, all tributes except for Tobe and Frida remained still and either slept, rested, or hid from the other tributes. This pair decided to ride their horses around to the north of the arena, where they had seen the hovercraft removing Jorge's body, but once they entered the northern sector, it soon became clear that the horses were having trouble seeing and walking through the darkness. Tobe therefore fed the horses some of the remaining berries, whilst Frida tied them up, and the pair walked southwest towards the northwestern middle ring, where Anna, Clara, and Diego were resting. This trio had decided to take turns keeping watch and sleeping, with Anna sleeping first. Just before she settled down to sleep, she ripped off 2 sharp branches from a nearby tree and held them tightly in her hands as she curled up beneath the tarpaulin. Clara kept watch to the north, whilst Diego faced south, and the pair spoke a little over the next hour about Lactonio and the other fallen tributes. Diego then announced that he needed to relieve himself, and he headed behind a nearby stone before urinating, yet just as he was about to re-zip his trousers, he was tackled to the floor from behind. Viewers saw that Stack had followed this trio, and when Diego had gone to urinate just meters away from where he was hiding, Rubius even predicted that he would choose this moment to strike, while Snow Square became extremely quiet in suspense. Diego desperately tried to fight off Stack, but he kicked Diego in the groin and ran towards Clara, who suddenly jolted around as she heard Stack running towards her. Clara immediately shouted for Anna, who whipped around in fright, while Stack grabbed Diego's water bottle and ran back to the north. Clara then pulled a stone from her pocket and ran after Stack, whilst Anna shouted at her to come back. She panicked as Clara continued to chase Stack, but when she noticed 2 more figures in the distance, who were running south towards Clara and Stack, Anna gasped in horror, before calling for Diego, who was still holding his groin in pain and trying to stand. Excited cheers flowed through Snow Square as Tobe and Frida ran towards Stack with their chainsaws, but when they were just 20 meters away, he appeared to notice them and panicked, before turning back towards Clara, who he did not appear to have realized was chasing him. As Anna was seen on the split screen to be breathing out in a panic, Clara threw one of her stones at Stack's forehead, with enough force for him to fall back against an adjacent rock, which caused a loud cracking sound to be heard when his neck hit the side of this rock. However, just as Clara appeared to realize what had happened, she suddenly heard the familiar buzzing of Frida's chainsaw from ahead. Clara yelped and turned back to run towards Anna, who quickly hid herself behind a large rock. Although Frida was taller than Clara, the weight of the chainsaw slowed her speed, and Frida therefore failed to catch her. While she ran between these rocks, Clara appeared to be looking around in desperation, most likely for Anna, but she failed to notice when she ran past Anna, who was hiding behind a rock to her left. Frida was now gaining on Clara, but when she ran past with the chainsaw just seconds later, Anna suddenly thrust one of the branches in front of Frida's legs. Frida immediately tripped and yelped as the chainsaw fell to the ground, then toppled over and cut into her leg. She screamed in pain, whilst Clara ran towards Diego, who had just fallen to the floor in front of Tobe and his chainsaw. Anna then grabbed her other branch and stabbed its pointed end into Frida's heart, which caused her to yelp and splutter blood, before falling back as Anna turned around. Meanwhile, Tobe had run towards Diego when Frida chased Clara. Diego had managed to avoid Tobe for a while by running behind large stones and jumping back from Tobe's swipes of the chainsaw, but just as Frida screamed out in pain, Tobe finally caught up with Diego and sliced his left outer leg. This caused Diego to shout as he tripped back against a rock and defensively held out his right foot. Tobe then angrily looked up to see Anna stabbing Frida, before bringing the chainsaw down against Diego's foot, but to the surprise of many viewers, these shoes were impenetrable from the chainsaw. Diego initially shouted in a panic, but after appearing to realize that his foot was not being cut, he seemed almost as perplexed as Tobe. Yet just as Tobe was about to lift the chainsaw into the air, Clara reached them and threw a stone, which hit Tobe's right eye and caused him to shout and stumble back. Unlike Frida, the chainsaw did not cut into any part of Tobe's body, but he scurried away from it whilst holding his eye in pain. As he tried to get back up, Clara quickly grabbed Diego by the hand and helped him up from the ground, before running back to Anna, who shouted at Clara that she had almost been killed. However, as they limped on, Diego said that this did not matter now, before looking around at Tobe, who was beginning to get to his feet as 2 cannons sounded, almost in unison. Anna quickly grabbed Diego's other side, and the trio started to head south as quickly as they could, whilst Tobe looked out through the darkness from his left eye. However, as he began to follow the trio, he soon appeared to feel too much pain to continue travelling, and when the hovercraft entered the arena and blasted sand towards him, he stopped moving and sheltered behind a nearby rock, where he stayed for the rest of the night. Meanwhile, Anna and Clara continued to help Diego south through the darkness, and after almost 10 minutes they entered the middle ring, at which point they decided to rest. Anna berated Clara once more for having run after Stack, but Clara shouted back to look at where they were, whilst gesturing to the arena around them, which made even Rubius agree. Anna continued that Clara was very nearly killed herself, but Diego insisted that they stop arguing, as this could attract others. This even made Eugenia laugh and ask how unlikely it was for Diego to be the voice of reason and calm. They continued in silence, all the way to the drop at the edge of the central oasis, where they rested and drank some water. Diego ripped off a piece of his t-shirt, which he wrapped over his leg wound, and it appeared to stop the bleeding. Clara soon fell asleep, and for the next hour, Diego and Anna looked out at different directions of the middle ring, whilst Anna tried to talk to Diego. However, she soon noticed that he was being quieter than usual, and she asked what was wrong. Diego joked that apart from being sliced with a chainsaw earlier, and only having a 1 in 3 chance of survival, he felt fine, but also stated that these games make you think. Anna asked what Diego meant, and he responded that since his girlfriend, Liliana, had died 2 months ago, he no longer had the will to live. Yet he then gestured to the arena around him, and continued that it was only when he knew he was going to die that he truly wanted to live. Anna proceeded to listen, as Diego spoke some more about Liliana, and he became quite emotional during this time, while stating that he had a bad habit of pulling other people into the darkness. But Anna quickly shushed Diego, and reminded him that he had helped her and Clara to survive so far. He smiled, and appeared to feel better. Then Anna told him to rest his leg and get some sleep, which he proceeded to do. Horn of Plenty played half an hour later, and the portraits of Frida, aged 18, and Stack, aged 15, were shown, which left only 7 tributes remaining. Rasper, aged 17, Katla, aged 17, Tobe, aged 18, Elle, aged 12, Diego, aged 16, Clara, aged 13, and Anna, aged 17. For the next 2 hours, Anna kept watch over Clara and Diego, whose leg wounds seemed to be improving. Clara then awoke and told Anna that she could keep watch until sunrise. Anna was at first clearly hesitant, but after making Clara promise to awaken her if there was any sign of danger at all, her mind seemed to be put at ease and she fell asleep, whilst Clara continued to keep watch. With every other tribute now asleep, the next few hours passed uneventfully, until the sun began to rise. However, just as some tributes stirred, violent winds entered the arena from its western side. Clara looked west for the next few minutes, as the sand in the western dunes was tossed about by these winds, yet as their intensity increased, the sand began to twirl through the air. Clara quickly awakened Anna, and just a few seconds later, they looked back to the west, and gasped as a tornado hurtled across the sand towards them. Clara shook Diego awake, which made him lash out in fear, but before he could say a word, she was helping him up from the ground and towards the adjacent hill that led up into the central oasis. Anna quickly turned around, and after seeing that the tornado was already passing into the middle ring, she grabbed onto Clara, who was now supporting Diego. As the trio tried to grip onto and climb this sandy hill, Anna appeared exasperated that Clara was helping Diego, but after realizing that Clara would not leave him, she ran around to the other side, and this helped Diego climb the hill, whilst the tornado raged towards them through the middle ring. After almost a minute, they finally reached the top of the hill, and ran into the ring of large rocks that formed the perimeter of the central oasis, whilst the tornado was now less than 100 meters away. Diego appeared to be out of breath and leaned on a rock, but as the tornado neared them and winds of sand began to lash against them, Anna gripped onto Clara's hand, and she shouted to hold on to a rock. Both Clara and Diego proceeded to push themselves down into the ground within this ring of rocks, and Anna lay over Clara as the tornado came even nearer and stopped at the bottom of the hill, where they had slept that night. Anna and Clara's dark curls flew around in the wind, but this in fact stopped the sand from hitting their faces, whilst Diego kept his face against a rock, which he also held onto. A minute went by, and Anna screamed at Clara to hold on, whilst viewers could see that the tornado was now just 10 meters away from them. However, Eugenia commended this trio for having reached the safety of these rocks in time, and shortly after, the tornado suddenly jutted off to the northwest. Once Anna and Clara's hair had stopped lashing around in the wind, and the trio realized that they were safe from the tornado, they breathed out a collective sigh of relief and scurried into the central oasis. Yet as Diego walked across the sand, it appeared that his left leg was hurting once again from when he had just fallen onto one of the rocks. He sat down on a rock within the oasis, although whilst Clara and Anna looked at his knee, they failed to notice that Tobe was running through the western middle ring towards the oasis. Meanwhile, the tornado had originally headed northwest, towards the spot where Tobe had spent the night, but he grabbed his chainsaw and sprinted south, before running east through the middle ring, and despite still clearly feeling some pain in his right eye, he appeared pleased to notice that the tornado was not following him. Tobe then reached the hill at the bottom of the western sector and used all his strength to climb with his chainsaw as quickly as he could. Tobe collapsed in the ring of rocks, close to where Clara, Anna, and Diego had sheltered from the tornado. He proceeded to look through these rocks and into the central oasis, where he appeared shocked to see Clara and Anna tending to Diego's knee. However, these three tributes were looking in other directions around the central oasis, and seemed unaware that Tobe was just behind them. He hid and continued to watch the trio with his chainsaw at the ready. All four tributes then watched as the tornado quickly headed east across the middle ring towards Katla, who had spent most of the games hiding in the northeastern middle ring. As the tornado hurtled towards her, she seemed unsure of what to do, and at first held on to the heavy rock that she had been hiding behind. However, as it came nearer, and Katla realized that it was not possible to maintain her grip on the rock, she sprinted southwest towards the central oasis, although as she ran, she was still whipped by the sandy winds that lashed against her eyes, hair, and mouth, which made it difficult for her to see and breathe. Katla continued running blindly through the middle ring, but Rubius gasped in excited anticipation as she unknowingly stumbled towards the back of a pair of black horses that had not been touched throughout these games. Although Katla was a safe distance from the tornado, her hair continued to whip around her face, and within the minute, she walked into the back of one of the horses, who kicked its back leg into Katla's head, which caused her to fly back through the air until her cannon collided with a large rock, and a few seconds later, her cannon sounded. The tributes and the central oasis watched in a mixture of intrigue and hope as the hovercraft flew in to take Katla's body, whilst the tornado swiftly headed south toward Rasper, who was hiding in the southeastern middle ring. Rubius excitedly stated that this should be interesting, due to Rasper having sprained his ankle the night before when he slipped on a rock. However, he simply sat and watched the tornado approach, without even bothering to move. Jeers were heard in Snow Square as Rasper closed his eyes and appeared to be talking to himself. Then, within 30 seconds, the tornado moved close enough to pull him into the air. He was swept around several times, and it was only during a replay that it was possible to see him. Yet after a few rotations, Rasper flew off to the west and into a rock that immediately sounded his cannon. Back in the central oasis, Tobe was continuing to watch the trio, who were discussing which tributes remained. Clara was still looking ahead for any sign of another tribute, and the tornado began to head west through the middle ring, towards the southwestern sector. Diego then asked if they had any remaining water, and Clara said that she must have dropped a bottle earlier within the northwestern ring of rocks. Diego got up to fetch his bottle, but the wound on his leg made this difficult, and so Clara offered to grab it. Whilst watching the tornado that was heading along the southern sector, she made her way to this section of the rock ring. However, as Clara reached down to grab this bottle, she was pounced upon from above. Viewers saw that Elle had seen this trio running into these rocks from the tornado, and so when it moved towards Tobe, she ran towards these rocks, where she hid and waited before jumping onto Clara's back. She screamed as Elle pulled her hair, and Anna sprinted towards them, yet Clara managed to throw herself backwards, which knocked Elle's head into the nearest rock, and she shrieked in pain as she fell from Clara's back. Anna then reached this section of the rock ring as Clara grabbed a loose piece of rock and held it over Elle, who screamed for mercy. However, Clara did not hesitate, and through stress sounds of physical exertion, she continually smacked this rock against Elle's head, whilst Anna looked on in shock. Elle lost consciousness within a few seconds, then as her cannon sounded and Clara stepped back, the buzzing of Tobe's chainsaw was heard from behind them. Viewers had seen through the split screen that after seeing Clara and then Anna run towards the other section of the rock ring, Tobe ran out towards Diego, who noticed Tobe and his chainsaw when they were just meters away. Diego jumped to his feet and limped away as quickly as he could, whilst Anna and Clara looked out from the rock ring and watched in horror as Tobe sprinted towards Diego with his chainsaw. Diego desperately shouted for mercy and held his hands out in defense, but Tobe grimaced as he continued towards Diego and sliced the chainsaw across his right arm, which saw him yelp and fall to the ground in pain amidst cheers of excitement in Snow Square. Clara screamed and ran towards Diego, but Anna held her back as Tobe slashed the chainsaw into Diego's neck. Surprisingly, Tobe then apologized, and as he ran the chainsaw into Diego's chest, Clara shouted at Tobe to stop, whilst looking like she was about to run towards him, but Anna continued to pull her back as Diego's cannon sounded. Tobe Looper was subsequently announced to be the male victor of District 10's Hunger Games, and whilst it was mentioned that any harm towards him would result in a detonated tracker, Clara gripped onto Anna's hand and warily looked at Tobe. He looked back at them with a forlorn expression, whilst gripping the chainsaw, and Clara thrust herself in front of Anna. Clara looked up to Anna, who was eyeing Tobe's chainsaw, but surprisingly, he remained still and simply watched the sisters. Clara began to have trouble breathing, and she said to Anna that she did not want either of them to die, but Anna then held her still by the shoulders and told her to listen. Tobe watched silently as Anna gestured to the nearest section of the rock ring and told Clara to run through the rocks and down the nearest hill. Clara began to protest, but Anna held her still once again, and with a tear forming in her eye, she told Clara how much she loved her and how proud she was of her bravery in these games. Clara at first refused, but Anna embraced her and whispered to her that she was brave enough to win the final. Yet as Clara began to cry and shake uncontrollably, Anna ordered her to run, before pointing to the nearest rocks. Clara struggled to breathe, but she told Anna that she loved her, to which Anna responded that she loved her too, and seconds later, Clara walked towards the rocks. As she walked into the rock ring, Clara was sobbing uncontrollably, whilst Anna had tears in her eyes too, and Tobe watched with a sympathetic smile. Clara gave a final smile to Anna, then she walked through the rocks, before sitting on the hill and resting her head in her hands. Anna sat down and looked at Tobe, before telling him to make it quick. He said that he was sorry, and Anna said that she knew. Yet Tobe then stated that he meant he was sorry any of them had been put in these games, and that they had to kill each other. Anna breathed out and performed a 3-finger salute to Jeers and Snow Square. She then closed her eyes, and Tobe swung the chainsaw into her neck, which sounded her cannon before her head had even hit the ground. Whilst the hovercraft came down from the arena's roof above them, Clara Paranova was announced to be the female victor of District 10's Hunger Games, but she was crying too loudly to hear what was being said, and within the minute, the hovercraft had collected both district victors. Tobe and Clara were immediately taken to Gaul Hospital. Clara was quickly sedated in order to calm her hysteria. While she slept, the capital medics examined her body, which was determined to only contain minor injuries and no long-term injuries. As for Tobe, his right eye was examined by medics, who debated whether he would be able to see from it again, and if so, whether it would be healed in time for the final. However, the medics performed some minor surgery that afternoon and placed an eye patch over this eye in order to help it heal. The next evening, Clara and Tobe were taken to Dalton Studios, where they were interviewed separately by Eugenia. Clara was dressed in a bright orange gown that was thought by most to look very glamorous, although others commented that she seemed too young for this outfit, especially given her status as the younger sister. Clara's interview was an awkward affair, due to her strong emotions whenever Anna was mentioned. It soon appeared that she was mentally unstable, and although Eugenia tried to focus on how she had become more skilled and fearless throughout the games, this did not appear to help. Towards the end of the interview, when the analysis of each death was performed, Eugenia informed Clara that she had become known as the Stone Sister within the capital, at which point she suddenly stormed off the stage, amidst cheers from the audience. Rubius then entered, and he analysed the bloodbath with Eugenia in greater detail until it was time for the advertisement break. As for Tobe, he wore a black and orange eye patch that perfectly matched his suit. He once again seemed rather calm and collected throughout his interview, but when Eugenia asked him about his relationship with Frida, he seemed more sensitive in his answers, especially compared to how he had acted in the pre-game interviews. However, this interview also became quite tense when Eugenia told Tobe that he had become known as the Chainslayer, and just as she was about to analyse his kills, he rather forcefully replied that he had only killed other tributes because they would have killed him, which even saw the Peacekeeper upon the stage walk slightly closer between Tobe and Eugenia. After the infamous reaping for District 9 that occurred on the Monday, Clara and Tobe were quickly escorted home to District 10, and it is alleged that during this journey, Clara refused to speak or even be in the same carriage as Tobe, who became rather inebriated on the limitless supply of whiskey. That weekend, Clara moved into a house in the victor's village with her father, and although he tried to support her as much as possible, she became a recluse for the first few weeks and barely left her bedroom unless she was forced by peacekeepers to make a public appearance. Yet after a few weeks had passed, Michelle Onassis and her daughters started visiting Clara's house. During this time, Michelle is also reported to have told Clara that Anna would want her to live and try her best in the grand final, which appeared to enthuse Clara, and she gradually began to let Michelle train her in some of her weaker skills, such as weaponry and toxicology. As for Tobe, he tried to visit Clara on several occasions, but she refused to see him. He therefore spent a lot of time in his house in the victor's village, with his parents and younger brother, where they tried to help him prepare for the upcoming grand final. Tobe also frequented the Rio stables on a daily basis, after apparently developing a fondness for horses since the games, which saw him become deft with equestrian skills over this week. Tobe's father also tried asking Casco Astriana to help him, but Tobe and Casco had a large fight in a local tavern after Tobe was rumoured to have told Casco that he would rather be dead than end up like him. Casco therefore asked if he could mentor another tribute during the grand final, but his request was refused by the capital, which allegedly caused several loud arguments to be heard from the District 10 apartment during the week before the grand final games.